Welcome back, everyone. I'm here with Roman Skaskiw again. Roman, this is the first time we've spoken since the Bucha atrocities, and I've often talked about how I know someone who almost bought a house in Bucha. That person is you. So, tell me a little bit about like where in that town were you gonna settle, and how close is it to what happened? Because the Blanca Street is the place where a lot of this happened. It's not the only place, but it was kind of there's a Wall Street Journal article where that was kind of the line of uh, Russian defense, basically, where any movement there, snipers basically just killed people. So, talk me through, where you were looking at buying and why you ultimately decided not to. And it was relatively recently too, right?
It was about a year ago. Yablunka Street is on the southern edge of the town, closest to Kiev, so it makes sense for the Russians that was their front. I've driven through Bucha easily 100 times. It's an affluent suburb of Kiev, and it's sort of in the direction of my in-laws. So whenever I'd stay with my in-laws, we would drive through Bucha on our way to Kiev for a variety of reasons. And there's a hospital on sort of the northwest edge of Kiev where my daughter was born, just like three miles from Bucha. We did not have a specific property in mind. We just drove through there. Like every time we drove there, we would spot new restaurants and, oh, look, a yoga studio opened up next to the stadium. And we're just noticing all the new businesses. And we thought it might be a lovely place to live. We didn't get as far as looking at a specific lot. But yeah, we thought about it a year ago. Actually, being close to Russia was kind of on our minds. I think I mentioned it to my wife at one point, like, let's move somewhere in the west of Ukraine. And then we decided ultimately to move to the US, where I am now. So yeah, it's close to home. It's shocking, like seeing the photos of the mass graves there, because it felt close to home. It could have been my home. So it's much closer to me than I think it is for other people watching this stuff from afar.
Now, you had mentioned a potential neighbor in the past who they found hanged. Well, again, this you weren't able to fully, like, completely confirm this, but these are the stories that you've heard. Can you go over that quickly, and
Yeah, so
what?
that's a little further than Bucha, and that's in a town that was never occupied, though it was bombed. Not severely bombed, but regularly bombed. And by the way, my in-laws are today en route driving back to that town, so I'll find out some details about it. And there in the town where my in-laws are from, we actually did pick out a property and also thought about buying that, but again decided still too close to Russia. Let's think about Western Ukraine.
What town?
Amazing.
What town was that?
It's a town called Malin,
Okay.
and it was sort of on the flank of the Russian advance. Yeah, so this is just a rumor at this point, but next to the plot of land that we were going to buy, which overlooks a beautiful lake, um, there was a big house, kind of like a little too imposing a house. You don't want a neighbor who's like cast a shadow over your property. But apparently the rumor is that the owner of that house, he was a successful local entrepreneur, owned a supermarket, and he was found hanged. It was a Russian agent, and he was discovered and threatened, or he thought he was discovered, or the story is woefully incomplete. But yeah, that's also like really close to home because would have been my neighbor. And I'll also add that it's fairly typical for Russians to sponsor entrepreneurs in places that they want to control. I think one of the stands, like Tajikistan or Uzbekistan, like half the main businessmen are just sponsored by Russia. It's a very typical strategy.
And they're sponsored by Russian oligarchs, like private investors, or are they
No, no,
sponsored
like
directly by the
by
Kremlin,
the
or
Kremlin. Like it
okay,
may take a circuitous route, but
right?
Russia
That's
is
what I'm trying to
very
get at.
vertically structured, and it's Kremlin influence. Yeah.
Okay, so it might come from a private investor who's an oligarch who has strong ties to Moscow, who may or may not be getting direct funding from the Kremlin to sponsor these sorts of activities.
Yep.
Because unlike in the U.S., there's a very close tie between business and government in Russia, right?
That's
In
right.
in the sense that oligarchs can't really run for political positions, but because Putin kind of blocks them from doing that. I think the head of Yukos kind of tried to defy that, and we all know what happened to him. Right, he was imprisoned and things like that.
Right.
So
Right. Although part of the Putin narrative uh, uh, is that is that he made war on these oligarchs who got their riches and their property through ill-gotten means. And there's some truth to that. Like there was a lot of fraud and a lot of like not coercion but manipulation when they seized all the after Russia collapsed. They seized all of their assets in kind of nefarious ways, uh, and they had free reign of the country. So part of like Putin's part of his prestige came from cracking down on them. Although he didn't make anything better, he just took control of the assets himself and cracked down on those oligarchs who weren't supporting him. And in fact, along those lines, like one sort of unintended consequence of the sanctions is that it gives Putin even stronger control over his oligarchs because they're now even more beholden to him because they're limited in their economic activity outside of Russia.
all right, let's go back to Bucha. What do you think? So there's a number of different narratives on this, and let's stick to the predominant one, which I think is the closest to the truth, which is that these atrocities were committed by Russians. So let's assume that for the most part. In terms of, do you think this was something that was ordered from the top down, or do you think this is more of a like a Lieutenant Cali esque sort of situation where the Russians got frustrated and they started, taking out or shooting civilians in order to exercise that frustration?
Let me start with some historic context and then I'll get to that question. So at the end of the Second World War, all the grandparents of people today in Eastern Europe tell stories about the violence of the Red Army. There's stories of mass rape. A little bit before that, American generals commented on the total lack of regard for human life from the Red Army. Before that, in the Winter War with Finland, when the Soviet Union invaded Finland, the Finns stopped marking hospitals and ambulances with the Red Cross because not only were the Soviets ignoring that, they were specially targeting those facilities. All right, and before that, Tolstoy, who's a bit of a Russian patriot himself, he when he described the life of the Cossacks in his novellas, The Cossacks and Haji Murad, he alluded to, without much detail, alluded to the senseless cruelty of the Russian army. So it has always been this way, and I think that's part of the evidence that like that you need to take that into consideration. So was it ordered from the top, or was it part of was it just a local initiative? My hunch is that it's both. What comes from the top is the identification and targeting of key people in a society. That's what happened in Crimea, for example. When they took over Crimea, a bunch of activists and just like high profile people, community leaders, they were taken away. And one of them was discovered murdered with signs of torture and mutilation of his body. So that's enough to sort of put the whole like resistance underground to scare it away. All but the most patriotic and fanatic people get scared away. So there is that very deliberate strategy that comes from the top, and I think some of the bombings of civilian infrastructure also come from the top. Within the ranks of the army, like I think it is local initiative, very likely, because it's a culture that's run by fear and intimidation. This has been observed for hundreds of years. Marquis de Custine, the French writer, said that they substitute policing and fear for civil society, or for a foundation of civil society, something like that, 200 years ago. So you have all of these soldiers who come from a culture that runs on fear and intimidation. I'm sure they don't have any training like we get about rules of engagement and stuff like that. It's just not what they do. And then they're in a situation where they take casualties, they don't know who's shooting at them, they're frustrated by their inability to accomplish their mission, and they commit war crimes. And I would say, like, what's happening in some of the, in some of the, from some of the commentary from like the dissident right, like they're just seizing on some detail, like, oh look, this corpse is moving, it's obviously all staged.
Oh,
But
yeah, there's actually a Deutsche Welt report that goes through like line by line and debunks them. So like the hand moving is a distortion from
it's
the
a
like a
raindrop
from the
on the
mirror.
windshield. But
Yeah, yeah,
regardless, like
yeah.
if you look at it like in the big picture, like there's intercepted calls that the Ukrainian secret services publish of Russians talking about their massacres. There are dozens of interviews of people from Bucha. Maybe it's in the hundreds now. All right, like of them just describing in great detail, leading reporters around, come look here, they lift up, this is where the shallow grave of my daughter or husband is. Like there's just such a mountain of information that seizing on some little detail seems almost frivolous, although we should also do it, like if someone has a big concern. Another thing that I'd be happy to do is if there's somebody who like I have good rapport with and trust, let's go visit. I'll be going back to Ukraine to see how my relatives are doing and to help them out. You could have your summer show from Bucha live on the ground, showing the.
I would if I could convince my wife to let me go over there. I mean, we're talking like within weeks, not within months, right? So I don't want to make any commitments here, but I definitely, you know, I'd definitely be interested in going. The other thing that I've noticed too is, are you familiar familiar with these POM3s, POM-3 anti-personnel mines?
No.
So the Russians are leaving behind these advanced anti-personnel mines that can, based on either the audio or the vibration of footsteps, can tell if you're a person or you're an animal, and will detonate if a person. But they're leaving all of these booby traps behind in these areas for obviously people to find. So there's some nasty, there are some nasty things like that are. And then there's the famous picture of the anti-tank mines on the highway, where you have the soldiers just casually kicking them
Yeah.
off the. Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff on the battlefield that they're still clearing up, which is also an interesting part of. I don't know if it's necessarily a war crime, right? But it's pretty close if you're doing that in populated areas as people are returning to their homes. So I mean, if that's what we're finding at Bucha, what do you think we're going to find at Mariupol?
I think it's really bad. I think we'll never know the number of people killed in Mariupol. By the way, the next town from Bucha is called Bordyanka, and there have been a number of statements, even official statements from Ukrainian officials, that Bordyanka is worse than Bucha, but nothing has come out yet. Perhaps they're only referring to like the destruction of buildings that came under artillery fire. So there's that too. Um, Mariupol, Mariupol's bad, and it's a little different. Bucha was not heavily defended, so it was occupied intact. Mariupol was extremely heavily defended, and the Russians got really frustrated. So I think 80% of the buildings have been damaged by artillery fire, some completely destroyed. So I think it's a bit different there. I think the number of killed is many thousands. It's a real tragedy. Apparently the mayor of Mariupol said that there are mobile crematoriums working there. So the Russians are destroying casualties. Let's talk about the mobile crematoriums because nobody knows if this is true or not, and I don't either.
I haven't even seen anything, even in our press, about
Okay.
it.
Well, it first came out in 2014. There was news
Mm.
that rumors that Russians were using mobile crematoriums to hide their own casualties, not to like eliminate civilians.
They're burning their own like soldiers' bodies, basically.
Yeah, I mean, and that's consistent with there were definitely videos of Russian journalists trying to film cemeteries with fresh graves getting assaulted or chased away. So they were making deliberate attempts to hide their casualties. We don't know if the mobile crematorium thing is true, but at one point the U.S. State Department made a statement that they thought it was true in 2014. Again, that could be the U.S. government doing propaganda. So then just recently they said the mayor of Mariupol said that the mobile crematoriums are working in Mariupol either to hide evidence of war crimes or to hide Russia's own casualties. We don't have more than that. Um, yeah, there's no like there's no evidence more than that, but it's crazy. It's something out of a horror movie.
Yeah, and the other so there's a really good YouTube channel that TC McCarthy turned me on to, and look, it's like an official. He kind of portrayed it as like this guy's been allowed to do it and stuff like that, but it's like straight like the guy's working directly. He's a public affairs officer for the Ukrainian military, right? But it's still
Okay.
pretty good. It's called Operator Starsky.
Oh, I love him. Yeah, he's great.
Yeah. So on his show, he claimed that they either captured or found the body of a VDV, like a Russian airborne soldier, and he had been collecting women's earrings,
Oh,
just like
oh
weird,
no,
like
that's well known. There are several pictures of Russians who were killed who had like jewelry in their pockets and stuff. There's a lot of that, and I think another like big, very revealing thing that happened since we last spoke was there's that 3 hours of CCTV footage that was hacked from a Belarusian post office with Russian soldiers mailing stuff back. And apparently all that information has been made public, and I've seen diagrams of like where in Russia the stuff is going. One soldier in particular, they know his name. He mailed I think over 100 kilograms of stuff back to his family. And again, that's consistent with Ukrainian with uh, phone call intercepts that Ukrainians have published about Russians talking about what they're going to send back. That's also consistent with photographs that Ukrainians have taken where they blow up an armored personnel carrier that's not like completely disintegrated, and they open it up and they see stuff inside. There was also one destroyed Ural truck that had three
yeah.
washing machines in back, and there's a funny there's a great Twitter channel called Evergreen Intel, and they just do
By
identify.
the way, for the audience, like a Euro truck is like a multi-wheeled like heavy equipment sort of. It's like a tractor trailer, but tractor trailer for like rugged terrain,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah,
Yeah.
military trailer. So there, Evergreen Intel is always identifying destroyed equipment, whether Russian or Ukrainian. They try to remain neutral, and they did a funny post where they identified the model of washing machine that was in back of this truck.
There's
He
a lot of
said, "This is."
Maytags, right?
I forgot what it was, but he made a funny comment like, "This is peak Intel right here, where you're identifying bombed out washing machines."
So speaking of washing machines, apparently there's like a trail of household appliances along the road out of Chernobyl, right? So did you hear what these Muldoons did in Chernobyl?
Oh, I know they dug in the red forest and got
Yeah.
radiation poisoning.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if there's been any reports yet that they've gotten radiation poisoning, but I think the speculation is if you've been digging in the red forest and you're digging up the irradiated soil, there's a bunch of cesium 237, strontium 90, which is like nasty. Like strontium 90 is a I don't know what the right word is, but it's like, it can get in. It's like a calcium sort of substitute. You can get into your cereal, like milk, stuff like that, and really mess you up. But they're doing that. I think there's like in an hour you can get a year's worth of radiation exposure in certain parts of Chernobyl. The Russians, like the staff at Chernobyl, told the Russians, they told them exactly where they shouldn't go, what to avoid, and the Russians just ignored them. Like I don't just that mentality is just so alien to me that people would ignore. I mean, the U.S. military would just if they had an operation like that, they would take it with finesse. They would have experts on site. Um,
Yeah, I mean,
I,
U.S. military has taken criticism for being reckless with burn pits
right.
or burning. Yeah,
Which, let's be honest, was not smart, right? Like, right? Why aren't you wearing masks? Like, just like simple stuff. But like, we're talking about the site of the world's, I think, second worst nuclear disaster. I guess Fukushima's was worse, but um, I just can't possibly imagine why they would allow their soldiers to come in and just not. They also shut off the electricity, right? And they started diverting diesel. Like they need so the army for a little bit gave them diesel in order to keep their backup generators running because if they didn't keep the generators running, there are parts of the reactor that would overheat and cause some serious issues. So the Russians gave them diesel for a while, and then when the war started going badly, they just kind of cut them off, and then just told the Belarusians like just make it work, like provide electricity to the Chernobyl plant from Belarusia, and like didn't bother like following up on the details, just kind of put it all on the Belarusians.
hmm.
Like, yeah, I mean, I don't think it could have quite gone. The reactor could have quite gone to meltdown, right? But they basically just put it on that another country to solve the problem and get electricity to the plant. So I think they were without electricity or didn't have that connection to cool the reactor for about 5 days, something like that. And they ultimately did solve the problem, but it wasn't the Russians, according to this report, that had solved the problem. It was the Belarusians. Now, I do take that with a grain of salt because we probably don't have great access
Yeah.
to information, and it's hard to believe that was it Rosatom, something like that, is the Russian atomic agency would kind of allow that to happen because they did
Yeah,
have
I
expert.
have the feeling with the Chernobyl plant, I do not have the complete story. The details that we're getting are insane. Apparently, the digging into the red forest that's backed up by satellite images, which I guess could be faked. I don't. I think it's unlikely. But
Yeah, I think these Muldoons were that dumb. I mean, having been in the army, I've seen stupid stuff in the army. Not that dumb, but I remember we were using like Kark paint to paint the tanks, and like these guys weren't wearing like filtration like masks and things like that, and they were like starting to call. It's just like they eventually did. Like we correct our problems pretty quickly, but I would see stupid stuff like that sometimes. I can totally and given the way that the Russians operated in northern Ukraine, they're you take the limited number of dumb moments you see in the U.S. Army and multiply them 1,000-fold, and that's kind of yeah,
with
I can
their
see that.
general disregard for human life, yeah,
Yeah, and just like I, lack of like solid logistical planning, like even like just basic like tactics. right? Not going into herringbone formations in the middle, like stacking up three abreast in the middle of a road, nose to butt, all that, all that tactical incompetence. I'm not. I would totally believe the Red Forest narrative because it just fits within the general stupidity and depravity that we've seen from this Russian army thus far. So there's that. In terms of kind of where do you see the next phase of the war going? Is the tank dead, as every newly minted journalistic expert says?
I think as
As an infantry officer too. Let's an armor officer to a former armor officer to a former infantry officer. Is
yeah,
the tank
the
dead?
future is light, super kitted out light infantry and nothing else. No, the tank is not dead. We'll just have to do more and more careful integrations with a lot of things, drones, anti-drone technologies. But the way to advance rapidly, especially over open terrain, was and remains armor.
Yeah. So just so that folks know, the next stage of the war is going to be in the southeast, kind of stretching from Kherson all the way north to, I don't know, Kharkiv maybe, or
Yeah,
Kharkiv.
East and north.
East, yeah, east and north.
To Donetsk, where I found out last week that my cousin is. Very bad situation there. And then north from Donetsk to Kharkiv.
Have you talked to your cousin at all?
No, I talked to his wife, so who's understandably panicked, and I get the worst, the worst interpretations of every little scrap of news, probably.
So, what did she have to say about the situation there? This, you know, relatively
Well,
recently.
since it's an active war zone, I don't want to say anything detailed. She just says it's really bad, a lot of hard fighting. That she's constantly afraid.
And she's there right now.
He is there right now. I
Oh,
talked
he
to his
is.
wife. Yeah,
Okay, but she's safe. She's in a safer
yeah,
area.
yeah. She's in Lviv.
Uh, Now, here's the other thing that we rarely, if ever, see. How, on a general level, and I understand why we don't see it because of OPSEC, operational security, things like that. But how is and on the Russian side, there are reports that as much as 20% of Russian combat power, so that's men, materiel, aircraft, etc., has been destroyed. Where is kind of Ukraine from a general level in terms of their combat power right now?
Oh, I would love to know. I've been very curious about that too. And it's been a total blackout of that information, understandably. But yeah, that's an important question. And I think the best way to guess would just be to look at ratios. I think early on when Ukraine did disclose their losses, I think it was 4-1. It was either 3-1 or 4-1. I believe it was 4-1, like Russian losses to Ukrainian losses.
Which makes
So
sense because the key ratio for a general attack, you'd have three attackers for every one defender, and if you're attacking in cities, it's supposed to be 10-1.
right,
And the Russians were nowhere near, I think, either of those ratios going
right,
in.
yeah. So I would guess that, and that's a shame because that's a lot of Ukrainians and a lot of very much needed equipment. Um, in the so this next phase of the war, the universal interpretation is that it'll be harder for Ukraine because
Oh,
it's
but by the way, the only statistic I did hear is that the Ukrainian army has more tanks than they started with at the beginning of the war.
I
I
heard that
believe
too.
that. I
I'd
believe
love
that.
that to be true. I don't know.
Well, because they keep taking Russian tanks, right? Like,
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I get it. I don't know. I don't know.
because part of that combat power doesn't mean it's necessarily on the Russian side isn't necessarily was destroyed. It's just lost,
That's right. Or
right?
abandoned.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, and lost could mean stolen, could mean any number of things.
Yeah.
So, Yeah, the terrain in the South is, as we were talking about before the call, is extremely flat. Like extremely flat is the sense that you don't even, it's very difficult to even see or detect invisibility lines. I'm sure like they have to be there. They have to be there somewhere, right? It's just very, very because look, I was at the National Training Center. There were definitely intervisibility lines. Now it was a little bit, it was in the high desert, so there were more mountains, et cetera. So, but it was still pretty flat, and you could see for 8 kilometers out, things like that. You could see tanks coming miles away. That's sort of the environment that the second phase of the war is going to have to morph into. And look, I'm a former tanker, and so take that with whatever warning you can, because I'm going to certainly have my own bias. But when I saw tanks in Fallujah, I was shocked. I was like, what is going on? I would not, that's a death trap in cities. And the Russians quickly determined that, but that was 20 years ago, right? It's like something we knew 20 years ago. Now, the US has been able to integrate tanks into urban combat as kind of a bullet magnet for the infantry, which I get, but still they're highly vulnerable to top-down attacks, things like that. But I did, in October of 2001, we did had a rotation against the 82nd Airborne, and the purpose,
my old division,
your old division, and the purpose of that training was to allow them to practice with these new systems called the Javelin. And at the time, I believe I was like I was an XO, and XOs, or executive officers in an armored troop at the National Training Center. We were essentially the scouts, not the divisional scouts, right? But we were the scouts for parts of these, what they call combat reconnaissance patrols, which would be in front of a motorized rifle, like a Russian Soviet style motorized rifle battalion. And we would have to move, a few clicks ahead of the motorized rifle battalion to clear enemy contact, and also assess and give the regimental commander the intelligence on where he should send his main effort. Okay. And as part of this rotation, on my route planning, I would draw these big circles around any major terrain feature, like hills, like little crevices, nooks, and crannies where the crunchies, as we like to affectionately call the infantry,
crunchies with the javelin could be hiding. Yep, that makes sense.
Would emplace javelins teams. So I think at the time I would draw a circle with a 4-kilometer diameter, and then I would just around those suspected javelin positions. And we would also get intel from division scouts about where some of these teams might have gone in. And then I would just plot a route so that our infantry, our motorized rifle battalions and tanks and armored vehicles would just avoid them. And the units that avoided them did just fine. We accomplished our mission. They just, encircle and destroy. The units that did not got slaughtered. So, but at the end of the day, you can't advance across these wide open spaces without tanks. So, the media with the kind of the newly minted like military warfare experts, right, who are talking and doing all this stuff, are acting as if the tank is dead. The tank is not dead. Okay, now there are new tactics that need to be examined and perfected, particularly with the use of drones and anti-drone technology. Because instead of kind of the old school way that I learned was every intervisibility line, and this was not something that was taught. It was something that we just learned from experience at the National Training Center. is that every time we were about to hit the next invisibility line, the tank commanders would literally get off their tanks, grab their, you've heard of death before dismount, right? Like that's going to get you killed. We would get off our tanks bring our binos along, and we would scoot up to the next invisibility line. We would look through our binos, scan the horizon, make sure there weren't any M1 tanks hiding. And if there were, that was great too, because I would figure out where it was. I would plot it. I would pre-register a target reference point with our, Katyusha rockets back in, or BM-21 Grads in the back. And then I would report, go back to my tank, report it to the rest of the unit, designate who we were going to take out. And then the moment we would go over the top, we'd creep up, get them into our sights. And then I'd give the order. The artillery would start raining down, and then the tank would be destroyed. And then we'd do the same thing. We would maneuver using the Wadi systems to get to the next invisibility line, and then we would rinse and repeat. And that's kind of the sort of things you have to do. But according to you, Roman, like that terrain's even flatter. It's like Nebraska flat, not Iowa flat, because Iowa's not really that flat, as you mentioned, right? Having been in the Iowa Writers Program, but it is the steppe, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's certainly what it seemed like to me. When you get out there past Zaporizhia, I've been to Mariupol and Donetsk in 2015, or Donetsk, I was there 2012, Mariupol 2015. And yeah, it's insane. It felt like I was on another planet or something. It was just so disorienting, especially as a light infantryman who carries a weapon with a 300 or was it 550 meter effective range. Like, it's just the horizon as far as you can see in every direction. And I'm reminded of old stories of like travelers in the steppes that used the stars to navigate, to know where they were. There's also an idea that around Kherson, where the Dnipro River flows into the Black Sea, that Hades from the Odyssey in ancient Greece was based on the Kherson area, because they describe just a flat land that goes forever and a slow-moving river in some ancient Greek literature.
So when the Ukrainians are asking for tanks and aircraft, this is why the tank is not dead. It's going to be challenged. But the tank is not dead because it's very hard to advance rapidly across vast open spaces with artillery raining down, machine guns raining down, with what kind of light infantry. Like you need tanks to do that. And at the same vein, the Ukrainians won't necessarily have the same advantages they had when they were operating from kind of the forests of the north and the cities of the north. Like that terrain is ideal for like light infantry, javelin, small unit tactics, things like that. Like that's infantry ground. That's a place where a tanker does not want to be.
Yeah, we could have used some mountains too. I've argued that Ukraine should be like, I've argued previously before this all started that Ukraine should be like Switzerland. Everyone needs to be armed. The country should be neutral, and we should be covered in mountains.
Yeah, you can't. Well, I'm sure the Russians are working on that right now, right? They're probably creating enough rubble that you can start to have mountains. Yeah, so that's my concern, because in that environment too, the Ukrainians will have better interior lines in terms of logistic support and things like that. They're also going to need to have that 3-to-1 overmatch from an attacker to a defender, right? So if they take the initiative there, it's going to be a little bit more dicey, shall we say. They're going to need kind of a 3-to-1 advantage in order to like generate an offensive sufficient to stop the Russians. So I imagine the early days, probably the best kind of operational strategy for them is to prepare for the first Russian onslaught and attrit that, those units down, to whittle them down a little bit, and then launch a counteroffensive, as opposed to just launching a counteroffensive to preempt the Russian attack. The other thing that concerns there's actually two primary things that concern me right now. Number one, Putin learned from his mistakes and adjusted very quickly, very quickly. That I could not see a Western government reacting that quickly to such an enormous setback, right? So he quickly realized he didn't have the combat power in the north to prosecute what he wanted to do. Rather than reinforce failure, he withdrew everything, regardless of how it looked, which, it looked like a debacle. But, give the man credit where credit's due. He quickly recognized the failure and is moving everything to the southeastern front. The second thing that worries me, like he's adapting. He's adapting very quickly. The second thing that worries me is the initial incompetence of the campaign, where they didn't have a centralized commander, at least according to Western media sources. So, and I think there's a strong reason to doubt that narrative, because it doesn't make any sense. It's completely confounding that you would try to run a military operation 500 miles away from Moscow, but it's certainly possible.
Well,
So,
I think they believe their own propaganda, and they didn't think it would resemble a war. So when you take that into account, it becomes more believable.
yeah, like they thought it would just be like it really was a special military operation, right? Like Putin
Yeah.
really thought that the sheer presence of Russian forces would break the backs of the Ukrainians and scare them into submission. And it obviously blew up in their faces. But that said, he's appointed a commander of the region. And I reviewed the guy's background. Unlike Shoigu, who's a complete fraud,
Yep.
this guy has significant military experience. I don't know how much war experience, but he went to he had was it the Frunz or Frunze Military Academy, which is like the Russian version of West Point.
Okay.
He spent I think 20. He was one of the first kind of the early groups of Russians in Syria. So he, again, without having done a much deeper dive on this background, like look, I'm going to be honest. I read a Wikipedia article about the guy, so God knows how good it is. So I'm
There's no reason for it to be wrong. That's relevant.
sure, but again, I don't want people to overstate what my opinion is. It's based on very, very limited information. But I would conjecture, right, without any evidence, that his having been in the Syria campaign is a tell to what Russian tactics will look like in this endeavor, which are going to be more traditional, which we're already seeing, right? Which is the rubbling of cities, the bombing of the train station that we saw, right? In addition to terrorizing the Ukrainian population, which I can't say if that was one of the aims or not. I'm guessing you would say that was partially one of the aims. The reason that would be a useful target is that you can prevent supplies, troops, ammunition, any sorts of resupply coming back into that region in order to support the pocket of Ukrainian troops that's still fighting there. So, we'll see. I mean, the Russian operation will be to encircle and complete the destruction of that pocket. Whether or not they can do it, we will see.
And another couple factors to think about. Exactly 1 month from today, the day we're recording this, May 9th, is a big celebration in Russia of victory in World War II. And Russian, I would say, identity is very fragile. I think you'd be shocked how much Russian identity relies on victory in World War II, with the caveat that the years 1939 to 1941 don't exist because those were the years that they collaborated and cooperated with the Nazis. But like so much of Russian identity is that victory. So I think I think unfortunately something very bad will happen very soon. Another wild card is Russian morale. Uh, it's hard to imagine anything worse, any worse morale than what we're the indicators that we're seeing from intercepted phone calls and other evidence from surrendered Russian soldiers. But the question is, how indicative of is that of the general morale? Are we just seeing the worst little parts of it, or is this will this can this be a general collapse of morale and willingness to fight?
Yeah, and the thing is, in the Russian historical experience, right? Like they generally take tons of casualties, but they always get it together at some point, right? They always blunder into the right answer, which is also, I guess I would say, is a third concern that I have, because they can just keep feeding the meat grinder until they get the answer they want.
You know, Marquis de Custine predicted 200 years ago that Russia could not survive 20 years of contact with the Western world. He was wrong, obviously, but the access to information is a huge liability for Russia because I think the reason that they were able to operate with such a disregard to the lives of their own soldiers and their own people is because people were very isolated and they just thought that's the way the world is supposed to work. Um, I think that's less the case today than it was previously.
But even if it is, what can the average Russian do? In fact, what can the oligarchs do? Right? They can't do any. Like, as my opinion is that like Putin's got that country on such lockdown, particularly among the elites. There's nothing, it'll just he will know if someone's even having a thought against him, they'll
Well,
disappear.
there is a unit in the Ukrainian military made up of Russian volunteers. And there was a bit of a tragedy recently. Two brothers who were from our Russian family that moved to Ukraine after the invasion of Donbass and joined the army, they were both killed this last week. Two Russian brothers whose parents decided to move to Ukraine after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. They just felt like a moral obligation. It's a big sacrifice. So there's a little. It probably is just a little, but it's a lot more than nothing.
Yeah, yeah. There's certainly, I think the last poll I saw was 83% of the Russian population
Yeah,
supported it. It's probably not quite that high, but I also don't think it's like the West portrays it.
yeah.
Like it's 83% against and this and that, right? There's if we followed all that, right, we'd think that like Chaz was like a broad political movement in the United States, right? So or that everyone on the right was a member of the January 6th
Right.
you know so I think it's like any society, right, where there's going to be a group of people, a minority who are against, and then a majority. Like I do believe the majority of the Russian population um, is backing Putin, and I
I
think
do too. I think there's no doubt about that. And there's sort of like just to share the Ukrainian perspective, there's like a perennial disappointment. Like Ukrainians always say or demonstrate through their actions, look, you don't have to be afraid of this man. Look, you can have some freedom, some representation. That's what the life on the frontier of the steppe represented before there was a Ukraine. Like it's like, look, you can be free, you just have to be a little bit brave. And the Russians always say or demonstrate through their actions, nope, we want to be oppressed as long as you are also oppressed.
yeah, yeah. Um, I don't know. Where do you think this thing ends up?
I think Ukraine will be a free country and Russia will go into decline.
Well, it's already in decline. Actually, this is one thing I looked at last week. Since 1992, the Russian population, declined from about 148 million in 1992 to 144 million in 2020. That said, their GDP grew by about 3.8%, 3.7%, something like that a year. Ukraine's population actually declined by about 15%.
Yep.
Now, I don't know why. I'm assuming it's because of a broad diaspora, because Poland had also had, I'd have to,
They were
in fact,
also around 15%. It was one of the worst in Europe.
and again, I think it's because of a diaspora. I don't think there's any major now Russia. I don't know. I think Russia is more of just declining birth rate, high mortality. But again, there's very likely some diaspora elements. So what are your views on that?
Well, there's demographic crises all over Eastern Europe. I believe Russia's is one of the most pronounced. And this is a rare situation in which two countries with declining demographics are at war with each other. I hope that a Ukrainian victory, and it will be for either a partial or total victory of Ukraine, will lead to sort of a baby boom. And let me also say something that's palatable to Russians, or maybe. I think Ukraine in the long run will liberate Russia from this curse of the Golden Horde, or this curse of the absolutism and tyranny of the Golden Horde. That Muscovy rose as a vassal state of the Golden Horde and continued all of their absolutist tyrannical ways.
And the Golden Horde being the successor to Genghis Khan, basically.
Right, successors of the Mongols. Yeah, so there was like a little bit of a rift when like the it's not as big as Russian history says. Russian history indicates the end of the times of troubles, but it wasn't an end. It was just a change of leadership. Everything else, the institutions all continued as they were, in my view. So I think that curse will be lifted either quickly or slowly, and then Russia can rediscover itself as a free country with lots of natural resources.
Well, here's a provocative question. With 54% of the Russian population female, why is it so bellicose?
I don't think it has to do with the ratio of women to men. That's a funny question, though.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's inside joke. um, but yeah, I'll explain afterwards. But you would think that there would be some sort of a calming effect, right?
That's true. In fact, yeah, I believe societies that have an excess of men tend to be the bellicose societies historically.
But China doesn't seem to be super bellicose, even though it has an excess of men. Same thing with India.
China's pretty aggressive, but they're just doing it in a very patient, sort of
Yeah,
slow-moving way.
they're not overtly aggressive. Like this is overt. Like
Right.
Putin is over the top aggression.
Yeah, I think here the political historic role and political system trumps ratio of men to women.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, I kind of kept you way longer than I had asked you to stay. So I appreciate your insight on this
Well, let me
topic.
add congratulations to your viewers on watching it all the way to the end. And check out Ukraine Freedom Fund. That is a charity that I'm directly involved with. We're doing lots of great work. Ukraine Freedom Fund.
And I'll put the links down below so that people can click on it directly. By the way, do you have any updates on how it's doing and things like that?
Yeah, we're buying stuff and shipping it every day. It's amazing.
And by the way, I also have a. Actually, I don't have it, but there's an anthology that we put out to also raise money for Ukraine. Let me bear with me. I want to pull it up so that building a better future. That's what it's called. And I have a story in it called Serpent's Wall. Are you familiar with that, Roman?
No, but I'll order it right after we get done. Is it on Amazon or something?
Yes, it's called Building a Better Future. It's edited by David Flynn. And let me see what it says about the proceeds. So the proceeds are, I think they're handled by a British or UK organization that will distribute the funds. So yeah, I don't have any more information than that. But all the proceeds, I think the proceeds are going to first cover the costs, obviously, so that that the book is paid for, and then everything else goes to Ukraine. So, but Serpent's Wall is based on there's like an ancient fortification in near Kyiv, I think, where that was built. There were multiple battles historically, and I go through a lot of Slavic history on dragons and things like that, and it also covers the Holodomor, and it doesn't happen during the Holodomor, but it happens after the Germans have left and the Russians come back in. So it's just a kind of a interesting story that is kind of historical fantasy, let's call it.
Building a Better Future on Amazon.
That's right. So anyway, help Roman out first, though, because that's actually going to trucks and body armor and things like that that could really help the Ukrainian effort. Okay. With that, thank you, Roman, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.